Um, Greetings to all of you in Vancouver. I'm sorry that I can't be there for this memorial meeting helping us to think about Giyoo Hatano and his life. But I'll be with you in a couple of days. And in the meantime, with some help from Beth Ferholt, who's behind the camera, I thought I'd try to make a few remarks to contribute to the direct memorializing of Giyoo's life and his work and his contribution to our lives. Of course, the word memorializing is all about remembering, and to help me remember, a lot of our memories in the environment, and behind me is a picture of a pear that was drawn by a Japanese artist, Kozo, who I very much liked, and I bought one and gave one to Giyoo because one of the things that we would talk about would be art and music and things outside of psychology. But we're talking about remembering, and famous for my belief that a lot of our memory is distributed in the environment, I went and I collected up some of that environment to help me remember some of the ways in which I interacted with Giyoo over time that I think are worth everybody trying to remember. And it's odd, I don't remember when I first met Giyoo. I'm guessing that it might have been in Sapporo in 1980 at the Japanese Psychological Association meetings. It might have been before that because I had been lecturing for a while in Kobe and had just started moving around the country. And there in Sapporo, people who considered themselves developmental psychologists, educational psychologists, were on the cusp of creating and becoming involved in an enterprise called cognitive science. And there you are, all sitting at an annual meeting of cognitive science, and Giyoo Hatano is being remembered there, not at the American Psychological Association meetings. So I guess we were sort of there at the beginning of cognitive science. Don Norman, Dave Rumelhart, others came, and you could see the coming together of psychology with the broader enterprise that neuroscience, artificial, and that began for me a friendship that lasted up till the end of Giyoo's life. When he died, the two of us were completing an article for a handbook of cultural psychology, and I'll get to that. But what I wanted to do and what I've brought with me here are 3 issues of the newsletter of the Laboratory of Comparative Human Cognition, because it was through that publication that Giyoo's and my conversations were very often mediated, and I thought his ideas really interesting. He didn't feel entirely prepared to present them to an American audience, and the neat thing about the newsletter of our laboratory was that it wasn't an official publication. It subsequently, like other things, became institutionalized as something official, and I think thereby lost some of its charm. But what I am planning to do is to talk about 3 lines of Giyoo's work that really lead up to the work that he and I were doing, and to try and draw a couple of characteristics out of them that I think are important for us to remember. The first is a paper called Kanji Help Readers of Japanese Infer the Meaning of Unfamiliar Words, which he wrote with Keiko Kuhara, who was at a College of Music, and Michael Akayama, who at that time was at the University of Oklahoma. And to understand why this was such an interesting article to me and why I was so pleased to be able to publish it at the time, you have to sort of remember that there was, and I think probably today in a lot of studies of literacy still is, the idea that literacy has undergone a long historical development in the sense of it's become more efficient, more abstract, in some sense better. And that story says that in the beginning there were pictures of things, either something stood for something else because it was actually a clay shape, or people inscribed pictures however they could have inscribed them in the tradition of the Far East, which is the origins of the writing system that we use in the United States today. It was cuneiform etching in clay. And that these initially there were pictures, then you had sort of hieroglyphics, which were also pictures, but where there were sound-alike elements into it. So you might have a picture of something that looked like either a watch or a clock, and then you might use that term, which is the name watch for a watch, to stand for the term watch, as in watch out for something. And that's clearly ambiguous and not a very efficient way of writing. There is well-known work by Eric Havelock, who studied the origins and evolution of literacy in Greece, and he claimed that the backwardness of the Chinese, this is approximately 1950 he's writing, the backwardness of the Chinese is to be explained, at least in part, by the relative primitiveness of their system of writing. And of course, Japanese kanji are taken over from the Japanese and from the Chinese and work on a similar principle. So I didn't much like the idea of this, although it's obviously attractive to think that, gee, the alphabet is this wonderful system of writing. It is an abstraction. The elements of the alphabet, there are only 26 of them or 28 of them, depending on the language that you're representing, and that with this, these abstract representations of phonemes, the basic constituents of morphemes and of meaningful distinctions in the language, that you can write anything. And that's it's abstract. It was a mode of thought for the Greeks, or so Havelock surmised, and that their system of writing both reflected and created science and all of the great things that we take to come out of Greece. But in the meantime, it sort of denigrates the accomplishments of the Chinese and the Japanese. And so here comes Giyoo, and it turns out that there was a man here at UCSD, Bob Glushko, who was studying with Don Norman at the time, who also began to question when orthographies of different kinds can be considered better or worse, and had the idea that it depended upon what level of mastery you had of them. And in Giyoo's article, he argued for the special efficiency of kanji, in particular for words that you're not familiar with. And I can sort of cut to the chase in this and I'm just going to read a little bit, but so you can get an idea of what he means. He says, let's examine two examples of the technical terms and their definitions. And he's focused on technical terms because a lot of technical scientific language in Japanese were loan words from, or concepts that were borrowed from the Western countries. The two terms he worked on were limnology and piscivorous. It's difficult for me even to pronounce the two of them, and I'm not going to define them for you at the moment. But just think about whether or not you know what those words mean and what you could get out of it. With limnology, you might think, well, it's liminal, or you might get the ology part out because you know from Greek that has to do with knowledge of or science. Piscivorous, maybe orus is, it's like, not sure, omnivorous, something about eating. So you could pick up part of it, but it'd be very difficult. But when Giyoo studied this with groups of Japanese students who did or did not know English, and also Americans who were asked to deal with these kinds of words, he found that just if you used kana in Japanese, people had great difficulty if they didn't know what the word meant, figuring out what the concept was. And that Americans, if they didn't actually know what the word was, couldn't figure out what the word was either. But Japanese who did not know what the word was beforehand could, when they were shown the kanji, figure out what the word meant. And here's kind of how it worked. That when you take the words for each of these words, let's take the word limnology, then what you have is, and I'll just read through, though it naturally has a phonetic reading, the three characters have semantic readings roughly equivalent to, and this is of the kanji, roughly equivalent to lakes, ponds, and studies, respectively. And these semantic readings can easily be understood even by children. In Japanese, we use the same character for singular and plural nouns. Such and such represents lake or lakes. Similarly, the component of kanji of the Japanese word corresponding to piscivorous are semantically fish, eat, nature. That is, when you knew the separate kanji and you put the kanji together, then you were able to recreate what the concept was, and the Japanese who knew kanji far outperformed Americans who were unfamiliar with these words, and far outperformed Japanese who were given the words in kana, and who also didn't know what the words meant. And part of what fascinated me about that is that it told me that the kanji were operating by the principle of montage that was made famous by Eisenstein in film. And Eisenstein, in fact, in his writing on montage, uses the example of kanji characters to illustrate the principle. And this clearly then indicates that, well, it may be difficult to acquire kanji because there are so many of them. And of course, for Americans, difficult because we start ordinarily at a late age and have difficulty with the spatial characteristics. Nonetheless, once you've acquired them, they then become a better tool than the alphabet for being able to get meaning from print. So if you're not real interested in simple unilinear notions of evolution and think that there's more than one way to skin a cat, I thought this article was really interesting from that point of view. Now, the second line of work was this was published in 1981, very early on. But the second thing that Giyoo published in our newsletter in January of 1982 was on the cognitive consequences of practice in culture-specific procedural skills. And in this article, you can see him on his way to developing what later became the sort of two courses of expertise, the idea of flexible expertise and routine expertise. And he has some discussion about these ideas and the way in which out of variations in the context, or by getting people to reflect on otherwise very procedural knowledge of how to do something, that you can move from sort of procedural knowledge toward declarative knowledge and then toward conceptual knowledge, which is the sort of gold standard for education. And he has an interesting discussion of that general idea, but this is where I first encountered his work on the abacus. And at this time, he was, and I think pretty routinely, for the rest of his life, even in his later work, would give abacus expertise as an example of routine expertise. Because abacus experts, while they were able to, maybe even without moving their fingers, calculate long lists of adding and subtracting long numbers, 8-digit, 12-digit numbers, about as fast as somebody could read off the numbers to them, this prodigious memory for numbers, or prodigious short-term memory for numbers, didn't translate into being able to remember the number of characters in the Roman alphabet or a number of random words. It was quite specific to the use of a mental abacus. Now, that's a very interesting line of work, in part because it's an outstanding example of internalization and the creation of a particular kind of a mental model. But in 1981, he was not optimistic about, and he talks about his pessimistic conclusions, Doesn't mean that we shouldn't be interested in this, but he found really very little transfer. It wasn't the case that children who had gone to abacus after school and had gotten pretty good at using an abacus were generally better in mathematics, in doing calculations than other kids. They did show some ability in subtraction and addition of multi-digit numbers, but it didn't help them understand, for example, the borrowing principle, and they still had the sorts of bugs in subtraction that other kids had. But at a later time, and I think this always interested me about this line of work, in fact, the children who became expert in abacuses, in doing calculation with abacus, were better at word problems. And the theory was that they're better at word problems because they had been able to automate the addition-subtraction parts of the problem, didn't have to think about them, so they could reason about the problem without being caught up with having to work out the procedures in the written algorithm. And then at the time that Giyoo died, we were writing about the influence of culture on the biology of human beings, and we returned to the discussion of the abacus because the studies of the use of fMRI with abacus showed that when engaged in having to do subtraction and addition, abacus experts show right hemisphere activity associated with the abacus that non-abacus users or just don't use, and that they themselves don't use when they're asked to show other kinds of problems. So just as he maintained a continuing interest in issues of literacy and representation, we later discussed that in terms of the inefficiency of kanji, because the early microprocessors used in classrooms were really used a lot for word processing by American students, but it took several years before the Japanese were able to work out efficient ways with much more powerful computers than an Apple II to be able to use computers for word processing. So at that particular moment, computers were not useful to the Japanese for teaching word processing skills, but true to the general line of thought, when the technology of representation changed, then they became useful again. Now, another line of work which was there at the end, and it was there very early on, work that he did with Keiko Inagaki, and a lot of this work, almost all of Giyoo's work was done in collaboration with other people, was one of the early articles on everyday biology and school biology, how do they interact, which later became, even in this article, became connected up with the issue of core domains, and is there a core domain of psychology but not biology? That Susan Carey's ideas at the time, or was there a separate domain of biology? And Giyoo and Keiko thought that yes, in fact, that biology was a separate domain and that it didn't derive from psychology. However, that's not the aspect of the work that I wanted to focus on. Rather, one of the characteristics I always, and this is shared with in all of this work, is that Giyoo had a way of interacting with American, and I'm sure other European, I'm an American, so I'll just speak of Americans, with American psychologists, and later renamed cognitive scientists, even if they remain psychologists, that at the same time took very seriously their ideas. He was very interested in Piaget's ideas and treated them with great seriousness, but also never denigrated or never thought that there was anything lesser about the way Japanese did things. It was different, and it had its virtues, and that is characteristic of this article. So the article is about the way in which children draw inferences from categories where they have to say what the characteristics are of, make some sort of inferences about persons, mammals, birds, fish, insects, plants, and stones, moving from animate and human through a category system that we know because we're schooled, and we're schooled in this system, which makes insects a part of a category along with persons. Plants remain alive, but they're not creatures like insects, and stones are not alive. And he studied and Sucari was doing the same kind of thing, and had the notion that young children would use the individual as the starting point and then draw inferences about creatures insofar as they are perceived to be different from themselves. Now, what he introduced into this, however, and what got him to think that actually biology or the thinking of these children was a domain of its own, was that he was interested in traditional Japanese biology. Biology not as, let's call it everyday knowledge, but systematic knowledge in the domain that we call biology, that it was historically of Japanese origin. And I'd like to read just a little bit about that. In Japan, for example, endogenous science before the Meiji Restoration and the beginning of Japan's rapid modernization, which evolved with medicine and agriculture at its core, included a lot of biological knowledge. It was not mechanistic and atomistic, but vitalistic and holistic. In that science, the human body was considered to be the prototype of other living things and also of nature as a whole. So here you have the moving away from the individual as a subpart of a science. Shoeki Ando, one of the distinguished scholars in that tradition, claimed that the human body is a microcosmos, as the cosmos is a macro-human. So here you had a two-sided idea. We have the idea of a microcosmos, but we wouldn't have had the same idea of the symmetry. Medicine and agriculture were considered to be alike because both of them tried to enhance organisms' healthy vital force, ki in Japanese, to overcome unhealthy forces. Bodily functions were interpreted in terms of vitalism. For example, the stomach digests in order to send the vital force absorbed from food to other body parts. We think that this is science. We think that this science is close to the prototype of endogenous biology. It should be noted that this was a science, not a technology, because it involved more than procedural knowledge. That is, it involved more than an empirical collection of input-output relations and the how-to based on them. It had some explanations that were understood in common by people who were involved and that were used in dealing with novel situations. Those explanations were based on the vitalistic causality, that is, X influences Y through giving Y vital force. Though it is clearly different from the mechanistic causality of our modern physics, it is identical to intentional causality. According to this endogenous biology, the workings of the human body, as well of all nature, are governed not by individual intentions, but by more or less autonomous laws of vital force. It's interesting in this article, too, that he shows that when children go to school, they acquire the categories of Western biology, and therefore, when they're asked to sort examples of persons, mammals, birds, fish, insects, plants, and stones, they show this sharp drop-off that occurs when you move from a person to mammal to bird to fish, or just a gentle drop-off that you get for a vitalistic approach, but that you get a very sharp drop-off when you move from fish to insects, in line with Western biology. And he also, by this time, has started to read Vygotsky. And he did read Vygotsky before, and he notes that Vygotsky's notion of true concepts, which for Vygotsky were based on schooling and science, reorganized the everyday knowledge. And he pointed out that the reorganization of categories by these children was a perfect example of that general tendency. Now I had, let's see, I guess those are really the three areas. I'm sure that other people have talked about them, that were characteristic lines of research that Giyoo pursued. But what interests me is that in each case, while he has contributed within the framework of Western theories that came from afar, each time he found a way to introduce aspects of Japanese culture which enriched our understanding of the overall set of conceptual resources that could be gotten by not discarding the old for the new, by recognizing the virtues of the old and placing them side by side and making that, enlarging the toolkit with which humanity approaches understanding of itself, rather than throwing away the old and thinking that the new is always better. So I'll remember Giyoo for lots of reasons, and I was very happy to be working with him, even as he knew himself that his time was running out. And I'll see you all in a few days.